Yes, we're going to start. Okay. Hi, everyone. So we're the Yeshivah Flatbush, and these are some of our stories from our parents or grandparents who came from either a variety of countries, so Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Yemen even, a variety really. So my name is Stella Lessler. My mother was born in 1973, and she left Lebanon at the age of 12 to come to the United States. So to understand the story of how they came here and why, we first need to go back a little bit. My grandmother grew up in Lebanon her entire life. She came from an extremely wealthy family. And, she grew up really well. She actually went to a Jewish school, which they talked about a little bit earlier, the Ilans. And she got married to my grandfather, partly, honestly, she told me because of the pressure put on her by society, as she was the oldest, and none of her sisters could get married until she was married. She was 25 at the time. My grandfather came from a very opposite side of the spectrum. It's a really rags to riches story. He was orphaned at a very young age, and he was the oldest boy of his many siblings, and because of that, he had to really take care of the family. And so he grew up trying to fend off the streets, really buying from the flea market and selling, trying to make a living. He actually was able to create a very successful business and marry my grandmother. And so they stayed in part for a while because of his successful business. Also, if you didn't know, in Beirut, there are two sides of the city. There was the Muslim side or the Arab side, and there was the Christian side. So when the Civil War broke out, they were really in the midst of it, and they really felt the effects. If you know anything about the history of Lebanese Civil War, they actually left pretty late. If you consider the years, they left in the mid-1980s, which is extremely late. So why did they stay? They stayed mostly because life was good. You have a successful business, you have a successful life, you don't want to leave your country and leave everything behind. So my grandfather, I said, had a factory and a business. And they started to feel the effects of the war somewhere in the middle of the war, actually. By the time my mother was born, they still stayed, but there wasn't really a Jewish community anymore. There was no longer a Jewish school. So she grew up in a Catholic school, and so did her older sibling. She's the youngest of the bunch. But they really started to feel the effects when my grandmother's mother died. She was killed by a sniper in her car. She was just driving home on a typical day, and she was sniped, and because of medical technicalities and a number of other things, she died from the bullet that pierced her car door. In addition, at that point, my grandmother's father died because of a stroke, so they no longer had a lot of the family connections. A lot of the family had already left, but they still couldn't leave because of an incident. My grandfather's factory had been hit by a bomb of sorts and blown up, and so did his store. And so in an effort to rebuild his family and his, wealth, he took out a loan from the bank to rebuild both the factory and the store. And because of that, they couldn't leave for years trying to pay off this loan. During this time, they were actually offered to go to Israel. Israel was obviously fighting numerous wars with the Arabs at this time, and they came in and when they came into Beirut, they tracked multiple of the Jews' homes, and they came in and they said, come with us to Israel, you can come right now. We have a helicopter waiting outside. And my aunt actually did go. She stayed there for about a year, and then my grandmother insisted she come back. Then there was my uncle. My uncle was sent away at age 13 to live with my grandmother's sister in France, because at the time, if you were a boy in Lebanon, you were taken to the war by one of the sides. And they didn't want him in the war. So at age 13, they shipped him off to France, and he was educated there for many years. So he never felt the effects of the war. They knew it was time to leave at some point, obviously, the effects of the war. And once the loan was paid off, they sent my grandfather and one of my aunts to America to establish a living before my grandmother and the rest of the siblings came. They started a successful business, and eventually they came. But the way they came isn't so simple. They actually paid off an official of some kind in order to get a travel visa for an entire family. Obviously, the US isn't that dumb, and they're not going to just give a travel visa to an entire family from a war-torn country. So they were able to pay someone off to get the travel visa, and immediately when they arrived, they applied for refugee status. Upon arriving here, my uncle actually had to come here. He had just finished a fabulous education in France. He was in a sort of, I would say, comparatively to an Ivy League school in France, but he had to leave it all behind in order to help with the business here. And my parents grew up, my mother grew up. My mother went to Magen David Yeshivah, actually, for elementary school, because Flatbush wouldn't accept her. And then she went to Flatbush High School after elementary school. And today, she is not only a citizen, but she has received a PhD from Columbia in economics, and she's an associate dean as well as a professor, so definitely have flourished. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gabrielle Hershowitz. I'm here to talk about my grandmother, who was born in Cairo, Egypt. She lived there for 12 years of her life. In the beginning, her life was pretty good. She attended a Jewish private school, and she went to shul with her family every single week. And so she told us how the Egyptians tried kicking them out twice. The first time they kicked the Jewish people out was when she was 4 years old. Her family did not want to leave because they heard that life outside of Egypt was going to be even harder. So they decided to stay in Egypt. And at that time, there wasn't a lot of Jews who stayed. A lot of them left without their belongings, but her and her family stayed. They continued to live life, and they were living pretty decently. And then, I think 4 years later, the Egyptians came back, and this time they wanted to get rid of everybody who was left there. So her father's boss decided that he and his family would leave, and they would give the business to my great-grandfather. So he had the business, and he was doing pretty well. He was very wealthy, and they were able to go to Alexandria on vacation and have maids, and they really enjoyed life. And then a few years later, her father was sent to jail, and he was in jail for 2 years. They had to continue living life as if everything was normal. They had no idea where he was or what he was doing, if he was alive or dead. And after the 6-Day War, they sent her father to France. That was the only option where he was able to go. So her family was told that if they wanted to see him again, they would have to go to France. So they left everything and they went to France. They ended up living there for a year, and it was really hard for them. Then they got their visa, but instead of going to America, my great-grandmother wanted to go visit her family in Israel. So they had to decline their visa and go to Israel. They were living there for about 5 years, waiting to get their visa to go back to America, because it was really hard for them. Then they ended up going one by one to America, and my grandmother stayed there and got married at the age of 16 because my great-grandmother wanted to have one less child on her head. So she got married to this wealthy guy that they made an arranged marriage for, and she ended up living there for 12 years of her life. And she had 3 children there and then moved to America because they liked it better. Then, yeah, here's a picture of my great-grandmother and my grandmother and her brother. And that's their vacation in Alexandria. And then that's a map of how she lived in Egypt, then France, then Israel, and then America.
Hi, my name is Margot Goldstein, and I'm here to talk about my grandfather, Michael Goldstein. Okay. So he was born in Egypt in the town of Alexandria on February 14th, 1934. He was the youngest of 7 children. He had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. He worked for the telephone company, installing telex machines and selling electronic supplies and radios, which in the end it actually ended up helping him because in America he was able to get a job, and because of his experience in Egypt, he was able to apply that to this job in America. And he was only 24 when the king of Egypt kicked out all the Jews, but he was lucky enough to move to America, where he met my grandmother, married, and when I was talking to him, he was saying that he was actually very grateful that he was able to come to America because of the great opportunities, and he was able to have a healthy family, and yeah.
Hi, I'm going to be speaking to you about my ancestry. So, my family immigrated from Damascus, Syria. They came to the United States in 1994. So basically they came because George H.W. Bush spoke to the president at the time, Hafez al-Assad, to let all the Jews out of Syria. And the Jewish community in New York really helped out. So life in Syria. So my mom and her 6 siblings lived in 1-bedroom apartment. It was a struggle living with anti-Semitic neighbors. So examples of anti-Semitism was, for example, they pushed my mom down the stairs when she was a toddler a bunch of times. Also, teachers used to hit the Jewish students with a big stick just for like behavior. One positive food was the food was delicious. So adjustment to America. So the Sephardic Bikur Cholim, also known as the SBH, gave necessities to the immigrants in the first 6 months. My mom came to the United States when she was 8 years old and went to a local Jewish Orthodox school. She learned English and graduated top of her class and even became salutatorian. The beginning was rough, but it became easier as time went by. So one main thing that my mom really can't forget is the Jobar Synagogue. It was a big part of her family because they were really religious and they went there every weekend. And some people say Eliyahu Hanavi hid there. So now I'm going to say a little story about my far relatives. So basically, there was a plan by three sisters and their cousin to escape Syria and eventually go to Israel. So their names were Mazal, Lulu, Farha, and Eva. Unfortunately, didn't make it. They were brutally killed, and their remains were left in a cave. So as they say, they did not see Israel, but Israel sees them. Mazal, Farha, Lulu, and Eva did not reach the border, but they have reached our hearts and our history forever. And that's their pictures. And that's everything. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to speak to you today about my father who lived in Damascus, Syria. So my father's name is Isaac, in Arabic is Zuki. He was born October 16th, 1965, and his parents' names were Ellie and Maro. He, as a young adult, kind of, he used to work for his father's, as his friend's father, at a linen shop just to make enough money so that they could live, because they didn't have such great lives in Syria, and my grandfather unfortunately didn't make so much money either, so he had to work and leave school to help. So my father lived in Syria from the 60s to early 90s, and in Syria they were just looked at as second class. Like nobody, even like him and all his friends would walk in the street and get looks, and never really like be looked at as just equals, and like they were never like loved. So even though that they were looked down upon and hated, my dad still was very religious, and he still went to shul every day. And also my grandfather was the chazan of his local shul during the weekdays for mincha and arbit. So my family wanted to leave, but they couldn't because there was a travel ban for Jews to leave up until 1992. Okay, so in October of 1992, my father left, and he took a Jordanian Airlines flight to New York after the ban was lifted in April of 1992. So my father and his father, stepmother, and 4 of his sisters moved to Brooklyn. So and 2 of the my other 2 aunts, his sisters, moved to Israel. So moving to New York was kind of hard because obviously moving anytime is hard. There was different culture. My dad had no money and he had to find a job. He learned English very quickly, and he got a job very quickly. He had friends here like that worked that were already here for a couple months. So that's how it was very easy for him to move. Like his friends today, everybody's here with him. So it's kind of like he never left. But yeah. So what my father misses most was he just lived such a simple life there. It was nothing crazy. Didn't have any real responsibilities and all that stuff. He really missed going out with his friends a lot. So he used to go to this town called Latakia, and they used to go to the beach with his friends on the weekends all the time. And another city that he used to love to go to drive up to with his friends was Dahan, and he used to eat at a restaurant there. He also misses climbing mountains with his friends in Latakia, as you can see in the picture right there. And when he was eating at the restaurants, it's that picture right there. And that's the restaurant that they ate at. It's called Buz al-Jideh. And that's kind of it. But he also used to like going to, with his friends every Thursday, he'd go to get massages and then go eat food, which is, I don't know, he just emphasized that. And what he misses most is how he lost his mother when he was 10 years old. And yeah, that's it.
Hi, my name's Frida Dava, and I'm going to talk about my dad, Jack Dava. So my dad was born in Aleppo, Syria in 1968, and he was one of 8 children. When my dad when he was around 12 and a half, he had to escape Syria, and it was very unexpected. He said he had no clue what was going on, but when I asked him what life was like, he said life was completely normal. I had a normal childhood just like everybody else did. So he said that one day he came back from school, and his mom told him oh, we're gonna all go shopping, we're gonna get new clothes, new shoes, and he was like, what? So unexpected. So they went, and then on the way there, he heard his parents speaking, but he didn't really understand what they were saying, but he knew that it sounded a little bit strange, and he was suspicious. But when they came home, his parents were like, oh, okay, we're gonna go for a barbecue. So them and a couple of other families went to this park where everyone would go make barbecues, and they started one. And then this random guy came and sat with them and gave my grandfather a signal. And they all just got up, left the barbecue as it was with the fire on, and just left. So 28 people were separated into 2 cars, and they just started to drive, and my dad had no clue where they were going. So at one point, they all got out of the cars and started to walk. So they walked at night for 13 hours. And the men that they were with had bags and guns, and my dad had no clue what was going on, and he kept asking his parents, what's happening, and they were like, no, you have to be quiet, and babies were given medicines to go to sleep, that way they wouldn't make noise and no one would get caught, but he just went with whatever they said. Then he was told, okay, soon we're gonna get to Turkey. So they got to Turkey, and the smuggler said, you guys have to pay me now, or I refuse to move, and we're not gonna continue. So they paid, and then when they got into Turkey, they went to this very, very small road, very random road, and saw 2 little cars waiting for them to take them. So they were taken to a little village where they were hidden in people's houses. They changed their clothes. All his clothes, by the way, were gone. He made a point to say that. They were taken to other safe houses. My dad doesn't remember how long he was there for. But after that, they were taken to Istanbul to safe houses run by Jewish families. And his family stayed there, like him and the other families, stayed there for about 10 to 12 days while the Israeli embassy made papers for them. After that, they all flew to Israel and just became Olim Chadashim, they just moved to Israel normally. They all settled in Netanya, and my father lived there until 1994, and then he by himself came here, moved here, settled in Brooklyn, married my mom, whatever. His mother and siblings still live in Netanya till today, and they still maintain their Syrian traditions and cultures.
Hi, my name is Danielle Towell, and I'm here to talk about my mom's story of escape. So my mom's maiden name was Antvi, now she's a Towell, and she escaped from Aleppo, Syria. In 1939 and 1940, my grandfather and my grandmother were born. In 1971, Hafez al-Assad was elected as president. In 1980, my family escaped Aleppo, Syria, and in June 2000, Hafez al-Assad died, which terminated his presidency, which allowed his son to become the president until today. So this is the historical context of what my mom grew up in. In 1980, which was the time of my mother's escape, Hafez al-Assad was the president in Syria. He was a dictator for 29 years. Although it was said that people voted every few years, he ended up having such a long presidency. The voting process was rigged. The people who tried to revolt against his rule were killed in the streets by al-Assad's army as their homes were invaded. There was no freedom of speech, and every Syrian was forced to cooperate with al-Assad's demands. He was a very strict ruler. So Jewish life during this time. Jews during this time weren't allowed to keep their customs and to learn Torah. If they were caught performing these activities, they would be thrown in jail. Arab kids used to throw stones at Jewish kids, including my uncle Shlomo, and they viewed Jews as a very inferior race. Despite the Arabs' hatred toward the Jews, though, they were still able to receive a proper education. There wasn't a lot of Jewish schools, but the people that really wanted to learn Torah were able to go learn Torah, in secret, of course. Her childhood. So my mom was born on October 26, 1971. So she might even be born in September, but she's not sure because she doesn't have her birth certificate. Her memories. My mother recalls memories of her father being arrested weekly for no reason. He was even thrown into jail for a month of being accused of being a Russian spy. My grandmother was also arrested a couple of times after she was accused of trying to escape. Their story of escape. The Syrian government only allowed half of the family to leave the country because they thought that if half the family left the country, were allowed to leave the country, then they would have to come back for the rest. My two uncles and my grandmother left legally, while my grandfather and my mom stayed behind. They got fake passports from one of my grandfather's friends, which I actually have over here. This is the passport. And my grandfather would even carry around a fake Arab ID that he would have to show to prove that he was an Arab when he was trying to escape. They got fake Arab names. My mother's name was Mahad Dakak. Sounded like Arab. What happened? Her with my grandfather managed to get on a flight to Paris, where they lived until they got a visa to come to America. So they lived there for about 9 months. They arrived in Paris without any of their belongings and had to learn French. My mom learned French, which she still even remembers a little bit till this day. And at 9 years old, she ended up coming to the United States and was able to finally reunite with her whole family. The religious freedom. So growing up very religious, my mother and her family wanted to come to America where they'd be able to practice religious customs without discrimination. She wasn't the only person that came. Her family wasn't the only people. They were with 40,000 to 100,000 Syrians, other Syrians, which left because of the corruption that was in this country. My mother struggled a lot when she came into America. She taught herself how to speak English, and her family had to work very hard and start a new company to support themselves in this new place. They went into the jewelry business for a while. So the lesson I feel like we should all learn is that since we aren't experiencing discrimination, we have to take advantage of the religious freedom that we have here in America today. We have to use it to our advantage, be able to practice everything out loud, and show everyone that we're the Jewish people.
Hi, my name is Rose Sternberg, and though I don't look it, my grandparents were actually from Yemen. So my grandparents were from a city, Attar, in Yemen, and they were told that Mashiach had come and that they could go to Israel where they would have freedom of religion and it would be safe for them to live and to have businesses. Also, my grandfather was fatherless. His father had died when he was young. And there was a fear because of that fact that orphans or kids without fathers would be taken by the government. So my grandparents were anxious to go to Israel. They had to walk from Attar to Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen, and from there they took helicopters and planes, which flew them to Israel. The operation the formal name is Operation Magic Carpet, but was more familiarly known by the name Al-Kanfen Sharim, which is a pasuk talking about how Bnei Israel would be carried to Israel on the wings of eagles. When they came to Israel, they joined Rosh Ha'ain, which at that point was just a bunch of tents in the middle of the desert. When they got there, they were the ages of 16 and 17, and a year later they got married. They also changed their names from Sleman to Shlomo, and from Benayeh to Batia. They had 9 children over the next few years and built a life for themselves there. Quite literally, my grandfather was part of the government, the deputy mayor, and helped build up Rosh Ha'ain into the city it is now today. My grandparents' life wasn't the easiest, especially toward the end. First, their youngest child had died in a series of accidents that had happened throughout Israel with an injection that was supposed to help fight viruses, but rather had killed over 50 children throughout Israel. Furthermore, toward the end of their lives, both of them got sick. My grandmother with breast cancer, and my grandfather with a disease that he actually picked up ironically while he was at the hospital. My grandmother, luckily, was able to meet my 2 older brothers. When they were younger, when they were babies, she met them, but she died about a year before I was born. While my grandfather wasn't as fortunate, actually, he was fortunate in one way. He was able to see all his children married, which was his one wish. 3 weeks after my mother, who was the last of her siblings to get married, 3 weeks after her wedding, my grandfather passed away. Part of the disease that he had picked up affected his heart. And because of that, he had to go to get all kind of experimental surgeries, one of which happened to be in America. This small fact doesn't seem that important, that he came to America for some random surgery. It was only later that we found out that the place where he had his surgery is also the place where my brother, now in his 2nd year at Stanford, now that he's now a student at Stanford University, and it was only in the middle of his 1st year that we found out that it was also the place where my grandfather had his surgery, which shows how our family came full circle.
Hi. Okay, it's working. Hi, I'm Alice Brinko. I'm going to be talking about my grandpa, Sam Brinko, and he came from Turkey. So
My grandpa was born in Turkey, and the Francos had a special tax exemption status because they were brokers, so they were exempted from taxes in Turkey. And in 1914, he moved to the United States to build a new life when he was 13 years old, and he just went from selling hangers. Then in the 1950s, he got into real estate and made money and started to own buildings on Fifth Avenue. And we have a book here where he kept records of like all his checks, if anyone wants to see them later. And he was very organized and had everything written down. So he came here when he was 13, and he had 13 kids. And my dad was the youngest out of them, and he had my father when he was 73 years old. And yeah, and he left 13 people to leave his legacy, and here I am today.